The 200-knot torpedo hit the water and the countdown began. 94 seconds. That was the entire window between life and a catastrophic hole in the hull of a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier. No alarms were screaming yet, but deep beneath the black swells of the Strait of Hormuz, the math of naval warfare had already shifted toward a disaster. One mistake, 1 second of hesitation, and the global economy would have cratered before the sun even came up. This wasn't a drill or a routine patrol. It was a silent execution order that the US Navy had to dismantle in real time or face total annihilation in the world's most dangerous choke point. The Strait of Hormuz is a 33-kilometer wide pressure cooker where 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. There is no detour and no alternative route for the massive tankers and carriers that keep the lights on globally. Iran knows this better than anyone, and they have spent 3 decades turning this narrow channel into a graveyard for anyone who tries to challenge them. They don't need to win a full-scale war against the Americans to succeed. They just need to make the cost of being there so high that the US is forced to back away, leaving the most strategic waterway on Earth in their hands for good. On this specific night, the trap was set with surgical precision. While the surface world saw a routine carrier transit, 4 Iranian submarines were sitting completely motionless on the seafloor. These weren't the old, noisy Soviet-era boats the West was used to tracking. These were newer, ultra-quiet vessels equipped with air-independent propulsion systems that allow them to vanish into the background noise of the ocean. They are quieter than the fishing boats on the surface, making them virtually invisible to the standard sonar arrays of a passing fleet. They weren't just waiting, they were hunting the largest target in the American arsenal. The weapon of choice was the supercavitating torpedo, a piece of technology that defies the laws of traditional underwater ballistics. While a standard heavyweight torpedo might chug along at 50 knots, these Iranian-made monsters travel at nearly 200 knots. They achieve this by generating a gas bubble around themselves, essentially flying through the water with almost zero drag. At that speed, the ocean becomes a highway for destruction. By the time a carrier's defense systems even register the launch, the kinetic energy heading toward the hull is enough to end the engagement before a single distress call can be sent out. Above them, the USS Ronald Reagan was cutting through the dark at 16 knots, surrounded by 5,000 sailors who had no idea what was lurking just a few hundred feet below. Even with the most advanced sensors on the planet, a carrier strike group has an inherent weakness: its own noise. The massive cavitation from the carrier's 4 propeller shafts creates an acoustic shadow, a blind spot where a clever enemy can hide. The Iranian commanders had studied this exact vulnerability for years, learning how American escorts spread their formation and exactly where the gaps in their sonar coverage are most likely to appear. But the US Navy doesn't travel alone, and tucked inside that acoustic shadow was a silent guardian of their own. A US fast attack submarine was trailing the carrier, her sonar suite tuned to the most minute vibrations in the water column. Even so, the Strait of Hormuz is an acoustic nightmare. The noise from merchant traffic, the varying temperatures of the water layers, and the biological interference of sea life make it like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a rock concert. The environment was perfectly designed to hide the 4 steel hulls waiting in a diamond formation directly in the carrier's path. At exactly 2:18 in the morning, a sonar supervisor on the American submarine noticed something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a loud bang or an obvious engine noise. It was a pattern, a tiny micro variation in the ambient noise at 47 Hz, repeating every few seconds. The computer analyzed the signal and flagged it with only 31% confidence. In a normal situation, this would be ignored as background noise or a distant generator, but this supervisor had a gut feeling that something was wrong. He recommended something incredibly risky: going active with the sonar to get a definitive answer. Going active is the underwater equivalent of turning on a flashlight in a dark room full of killers. It reveals exactly where you are to everyone in the area. The officer of the deck hesitated for only 3 seconds before giving the order. A single powerful sonar ping was sent out, slicing through the thermocline and bouncing off the lower water column. The return was chilling. Instead of a false alarm, the screens lit up with 4 hard geometric reflections. Not 1, but 4 separate submarines were positioned in a coordinated formation, already within their primary weapons range of the carrier. The moment those returns hit the screen, the entire strike group transformed. It wasn't chaos, it was a clinical, pre-programmed response that had been rehearsed thousands of times. Battle stations were called in 41 seconds. Helicopters were in the air in under 2 minutes. Destroyers began breaking formation to create a protective screen around the Reagan. Through a real-time data network called Link 16, every ship and aircraft in the fleet saw the exact location of the threat at the same time. The single organism of the US Navy had been poked, and now it was waking up with terrifying speed. Realizing the surprise was gone, the Iranian commander made a desperate choice. He ordered a saturated launch of everything they had. Missiles broke the surface less than a mile from the carrier, their rocket motors lighting up the night sky as they searched for the massive radar cross-section of the ship. This was the layered attack they had planned for years. The missiles were meant to draw the attention of the defense systems upward, forcing the crew to focus on the air threat while the high-speed torpedoes did the real damage below the waterline. It was a play for a gap in American time and attention. The carrier's electronic warfare suite didn't wait for a human to pull a trigger. The instant the Iranian missiles activated their radar seekers, the Reagan systems identified the exact frequency and waveform of the threat. In less than 200 milliseconds, a wall of jamming energy was blasted back at the missiles, blinding their sensors instantly. 2 of the missiles lost their lock and plunged uselessly into the sea. The third missile managed to stay on course using backup guidance, but it was headed straight into a wall of lead from the carrier's close-in weapon system, which can fire 4,500 rounds per minute. While the sky was filled with fire and jamming, the real danger was still under the surface. The supercavitating torpedoes were closing the distance at speeds that shouldn't be possible underwater. The math was simple and brutal. The carrier had less than 90 seconds to live if those weapons hit home, but the US attack submarine had already moved into a blocking position. It wasn't just there to watch, it was there to act as a shield. The crew began deploying high-amplitude acoustic decoys that mimicked the carrier's engine signature, creating a much more tempting target for the incoming torpedo sensors. The first Iranian torpedo bit on the bait. It veered away from the carrier and chased the decoy into the deep, eventually exploding harmlessly miles away from any ship. The second torpedo faced a different fate. Because these weapons rely on a fragile gas bubble to maintain their insane speed, any disruption can be fatal to the run. As it entered a patch of turbulent water created by the carrier's maneuvers, the supercavitation envelope collapsed. The sudden spike in drag was like hitting a brick wall at 200 miles per hour. The torpedo's guidance failed, its speed plummeted, and it sank to the bottom just 200 meters from the hull. With the defensive phase over, the US Navy went on the offensive. The Seahawk helicopters that had launched minutes earlier were now hovering directly over the last known positions of the Iranian submarines. These crews are trained to find needles in haystacks, and with the data from the carrier's sonar, they didn't have to look hard. They began dropping lightweight torpedoes into the water, specifically designed to hunt and destroy coastal submarines in shallow water. The hunters had officially become the hunted, and there was nowhere left for the 4 Iranian boats to hide in the narrow confines of the strait. One of the Iranian submarines tried a desperate emergency ascent to the surface, hoping to transmit data or perhaps even surrender. It broached the water for 7 seconds, sending out a burst of encrypted data to its command center on the mainland, but it was too late. An anti-submarine rocket launched from a nearby US destroyer was already in the air. The rocket traveled 4 kilometers in seconds, delivering its payload directly onto the 4th contact. By 2:31 a.m., the sensors on the American submarine reported a grim reality. All 4 of the Iranian acoustic signatures had gone completely silent. The entire engagement, from that first suspicious 31% confidence flag to the final weapon impact, lasted exactly 11 minutes and 47 seconds. To an outside observer, it might have seemed like nothing happened at all. The USS Ronald Reagan never even changed its course. It continued pushing through the strait at a steady pace, its perimeter re-established and its crew back at high alert status. Not a single American sailor was injured and not a single piece of equipment was lost. The US Navy had just dismantled a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar threat in the time it takes to eat a quick lunch. What makes this story so incredible is that almost no one heard about it. There were no press releases from the Pentagon and no triumphant speeches from the White House. Iranian state media eventually reported that 4 of their vessels had failed to return from a routine training exercise, but they never filed a diplomatic protest or published photographs of the wreckage. Both sides understood the unspoken rules of this shadow war. When you play for the highest stakes in the world's most dangerous waterway and lose, you don't complain to the neighbors. You quietly bury your losses and start planning for the next move. This wasn't just a win for the crew on that specific night. It was a victory for decades of American strategic investment. While Iran spent years building faster torpedoes and stealthier hulls, the US was investing in something much less glamorous: data networks and sensor fusion. The real weapon that won the battle wasn't a missile or a gun. It was the invisible infrastructure of detection. The ability to link every ship, plane, and submarine into a single, thinking organism meant that a surprise attack was impossible the moment one single person noticed something was slightly off in the water. We often focus on the billion-dollar ships, but the entire outcome of this engagement rested on a single sonar supervisor who decided to trust his gut. His computer told him the signal was probably nothing. The statistics said it was noise. In almost any other navy, that sailor might have been ignored or told to keep quiet to avoid a false alarm. But the US Navy's culture of empowering individual decision-makers at the lowest levels allowed him to push for an active ping. That one decision saved a carrier and prevented a global economic collapse that would have followed a successful strike on the Reagan. The message sent that night was loud and clear, even if it was delivered in total silence. It told the Iranian leadership that their backyard wasn't as secure as they thought. They had spent 30 years designing a trap specifically to exploit the weaknesses of the US Navy, only to find out that those weaknesses had already been accounted for. The US showed that it can go anywhere, anytime, and that its technology isn't just about being bigger, it's about being smarter. The cost Iran tried to impose on American operations in the region was paid in full by their own elite submarine force. If that carrier had been hit, the price of oil would have tripled overnight. Insurance rates for shipping would have skyrocketed, and the global supply chain would have been paralyzed with fear. The Strait of Hormuz is the jugular vein of the modern world, and for 12 minutes it was being squeezed by 4 submarines that very few people even knew existed. The fact that you can still fill up your car and buy goods from across the ocean is a direct result of these silent engagements that happen in the dark, far away from the eyes of the public and the cameras of the news. This engagement represents a new era of naval warfare, where the lines between peace and conflict are blurred. There are no declarations of war, no front lines, and often no public acknowledgement of the casualties. It is a constant, high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows of the world's most critical infrastructure. The US Navy unleashed its full capability that night, not with a massive bombardment, but with a surgical and clinical removal of a threat that most people wouldn't even recognize as a danger until it was too late to do anything about it. As the world's oceans become more crowded and the technology of our rivals continues to evolve, the burden on the US Navy only grows heavier. The Strait of Hormuz remains a powder keg, and the silent war beneath its surface shows no signs of slowing down. But on that one dark night, the system worked exactly as it was designed to. It reminds us that the most powerful force in the world isn't just the steel and the fire, it's the vigilance of those watching the screens when everyone else is asleep. The ocean is vast and unforgiving, but for those 12 minutes, the US Navy proved that nowhere is truly hidden.